Jäger spent 3 decades in the Yakut Taiga and knew it the way only those know it who have stopped being afraid and learned to listen. He could unfailingly distinguish tracks, where a moose had passed and where a bear. He knew how to read the snow, understood the habits of animals, knew where they appeared and where they never did. Over those years, there was almost nothing left that he could not explain. But in November 1978, he encountered something that defied all logic. He returned 2 weeks later, more silent than usual, with some kind of object hidden at the bottom of his backpack. He showed it to no one. When his wife asked, he answered briefly, "Nothing, just tired." But she did not believe him. Over 20 years of living together, she had learned to distinguish ordinary fatigue from something else. And this was clearly not that. He carried that object with him for the rest of his life, never revealing what had happened then in the taiga. He broke his silence only before his death, when illness began to slowly take him. A strange, incomprehensible illness, one that left doctors only shrugging, offering different theories, none of which proved correct. Then he called his son and told him everything. Later, the son recalled that he listened and did not know how to react, whether to believe or not, whether to cry or laugh. In the end, he simply listened to the end. The Yakut Taiga is not a forest in the sense familiar to a city person. It is not a place you can pass through from point A to point B. It has no other side. It stretches endlessly beyond every ridge, every river, every swamp, uniform in its vastness, and at the same time different in its details. The people who live there fall into two categories: those who are afraid and those who are accustomed to fear. And the latter are not so because they have nothing to fear, but because fear becomes part of the background, like breathing.
They feel it, but do not react to it until it becomes necessary.
Yegor became a hunter in the same way as most men in those parts after the war. He had been brought into the taiga from childhood. His father took him along at 7, his grandfather even earlier. By the time it came to choosing a path in life, there was no choice left. It had already been determined by thousands of hours spent in the forest. He was not tall, but sturdy, with a typical northern appearance. Broad cheekbones, narrow, dark eyes, skin roughened by frost, so much that his age was almost unreadable. At 40, he looked 50, and at 50, he still looked 50. He spoke little, only to the point, not out of introversion, but from the habit of valuing words. In the taiga, they carry more weight than in the city. He was born in 1928 in a small settlement, about 120 kilometers from Yakutsk. There he grew up, married, lived his whole life, and died. The war did not touch him. He was too young and too far from the front. But it left in him a quiet sense of guilt, which manifested itself in a particular respect for those who had gone through it. At 20, he became a professional hunter, receiving his own territory in 1948. Over the next 3 decades, he covered so much ground in the taiga that any geographer might envy him. He saw many things: bears, wolverines, once something huge and dark in a river, which disappeared into the depths before he could understand what it was. He told no one about it. He could not find words that would not sound like fiction. He encountered places where animals did not appear for no visible reason, saw trees growing against wind and light, as if they were being pulled somewhere from beneath the ground. And for all of this, he found explanations, not always precise, not always convincing to others, but sufficient for himself. The taiga could be strange, but up to a certain point, it remained understandable to him. He had understood and accepted this long ago. Strangeness is just as much a part of the taiga as frost or night darkness. He lived with his wife Matriona, with whom, by 1978, he had already spent more than 20 years, and with his son Alexei, who was then 22 and just beginning his own path as a hunter. Matriona was one of those northern women rarely written about: practical, patient, able to wait for a man from the forest for weeks. She worried, of course, but that worry always remained inside and did not interfere with life. She knew Lykov well, his silence, his habits, the difference between fatigue and trevoga. She understood when to ask questions and when it was better to remain silent. Over the years of living together, it had become almost instinctive. She felt his state even before he could express it himself. When he returned from that November trip, she immediately understood. It was not fatigue and not trevoga. It was something else, something for which there was no name. something that had come into the house with him and stayed there. The trip itself had been ordinary, planned, a seasonal hunt. The route was familiar, traveled many times before, just 2 days from the settlement, nothing unusual. He left at the beginning of November, was supposed to return in 10 days, but came back only after 14. He explained those extra 4 days by snowfall, said he had to wait it out. The weather really had been bad then. Matriona later checked with the neighbors. The snow had fallen. But for Lykov, who had spent 30 years walking the taiga in any weather, such an explanation did not sound convincing. These were words that concealed something rather than explained it. It all began on the 6th day of his route. He was walking through a familiar ravine between low ridges, a place where game was always found and where he had set traps for years. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, and there were many tracks, sable, hare, and a moose track crossing the ravine diagonally. He walked, reading them as he went, like a long, familiar text, and suddenly he stopped. To the left, about 20 meters from his path, there was a print in the snow that did not match any track he knew. He approached, crouched, took off his mitten, and ran his hand along the edges. In shape, it was human. Foot, heel, toes, everything like a human's. No claws, no hooves, but the size. He placed his own foot beside it. His size 44 boot occupied less than half of that imprint. The tracks formed a chain. The stride was very long, so long that for a human it would mean running. But the depth of the imprint in the snow suggested otherwise. Whoever had left the tracks was walking calmly, confidently, unhurried. Lykov followed them with his gaze. The line went north, in a direction he had not planned to go that season. He stood for a long time over those tracks, sorting through possibilities in his mind. A bear? No, he had known bear tracks since childhood. A moose? A moose has hooves. The shape was human, but people of that size do not exist. And one more detail, the track was barefoot. In the November taiga, in temperatures near minus 30 degrees. He noted this too, but did not immediately try to process it. It did not fit into his usual picture of the world. He did not make a decision right away. He stood there, considered what he had seen, and then turned and followed the tracks north. Over 30 years, the taiga had instilled in him a simple law. Everything unclear must be understood. Everything unknown must be learned. To leave it behind would mean thinking about it all the way home, about something he had not clarified, and that contradicted everything he had been taught and had learned himself. The tracks led him into a small valley squeezed between slopes. On 3 sides, it was closed off by dense spruce forest, and only from the south was it open. The place was unfamiliar, although he had been in this area many times. Either he had passed by it before without noticing, or it somehow escaped attention. 2 hours from his usual route, and he did not even know such a valley existed. That alone seemed strange. In the center of the valley stood a house. Later, he would describe that house to his son many times, returning to the details again and again, as if memory revealed them gradually, piece by piece. The house was log-built, real, solid, with thick larch walls, a roof, a door, and small windows covered with something translucent. It had been constructed properly, thoroughly, the way people build who have devoted their lives to it. This was not a temporary shelter, but a full-fledged dwelling for long-term living. But everything about it was unusually large. The door was about 3 times the usual size. The threshold reached his waist. The windows were placed where, in a normal house, the roof would already begin. He walked around the house, examined it from bottom to top, counted the logs, estimated the dimensions. Each log was almost half his height and thickness, old, dense larch that could not be felled without great strength. Everything suggested that it had been built for someone to whom an ordinary hut would seem cramped, for a creature 3 or even 4 times larger than a human. The tracks led straight to the door and ended there. That meant the owner was either inside or had left very recently. Lykov stood at the entrance for a long time, then knocked. The habitual rule applied. Before entering someone else's home, one must give warning. There was no answer. Then he pushed the door. It opened easily, without a creak, on neatly fitted hinges made of some dark material that did not resemble metal. He bent down and entered. Inside, everything matched the scale of the house. The table was so large that one could lie on it at full length and still have space left. A bench along the wall was at the level of his shoulders. He had to reach up to touch it. In the corner, there was a hearth made of stones, and the ash in it was warm. That meant it had been used recently, which meant the owner might return. On a shelf stood wooden utensils, bowls the size of small troughs, spoons more like shovels. Everything was made carefully, without haste, by the hands of a master. The floor was covered with skins, but he could not determine what animal they belonged to. They were too large for anything he knew. The house smelled lived in, warm, alive, the kind of smell that exists where people live and heat their dwelling. Near the utensils lay various objects, carved bone items with incomprehensible symbols, bundles of herbs tied with sinew, a piece of smooth, dark stone the size of a fist, also marked with patterns. Later he would recognize those symbols. The mistress gave him a similar object, only smaller. He understood that he needed to leave. Outside, the temperature was below -30. He had already walked 2 hours off his route, and he would need another 2 to return, and darkness came early. But he looked at the warm ash in the hearth, at the door, then took some food from his backpack and left it on the table, either as payment or as a sign of respect. After that, he settled near the hearth, laying out his sleeping bag, deciding to spend the night there. He decided if the owner returned, he would stand up, explain himself, and leave. But no one came by morning. He stayed a second night as well. The weather worsened outside. The frost intensified by another 10 degrees, and the wind rose. The Taiga seemed to give him an excuse, and he used it. By the third day, it was clear. It was no longer about the weather. He was waiting for the owner. She appeared on the third day. By that time, he was already preparing to leave, deciding that the house might be abandoned despite the warm ash in the hearth. He was packing his backpack, considering the return route, when he heard a sound outside. Heavy, very heavy footsteps. The floor beneath his feet trembled slightly. A shadow covered the window. The door opened. She entered, bending down. Even for such a huge door, she had to stoop. Inside, she straightened to her full height. Lykov stood by the table with his backpack in his hands and looked at her. Later, his son would ask many times what she looked like, and each time the father answered the same way, ending the description with one word: beautiful. He said she was very tall, almost reaching the ceiling of that large house. Long, dark hair, regular facial features somewhat reminiscent of northern peoples, but larger and different, more ancient. He did not say this with surprise or admiration, just as a fact. She looked at him. He stood motionless. She did not move either. Then her gaze slid to the food he had left on the table 3 days earlier. It lay untouched. Then back to him. Later, he tried many times to describe the expression on her face, and always said words were imprecise. The closest was evaluating. She looked at him as if she had long expected him and had finally seen him. Not with surprise, but as confirmation of something anticipated. She said something. The language was unfamiliar. Not Yakut, not Evenki, not Russian. It sounded different. Another rhythm, another intonation, as if more ancient. He shook his head. She looked at him again for a long time, as if trying to find a way to convey meaning without words. Then she gestured. Sit, hand down toward the floor. That gesture he understood. He sat. She placed a large pot on the fire. Soon the house filled with the smell of meat and herbs. Unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. She poured some into a bowl for him. He ate and looked at her, understanding that in all his years in the taiga, he had never encountered anything that could explain what was happening. She was real. She was here. She was feeding him dinner in her home as if it were completely ordinary. He asked her name, first in Russian, then in Yakut. She listened, then said a single short word. He remembered its sound, but did not understand its meaning. She pointed to herself and repeated it more slowly. He tried to repeat it. It came out inaccurately, that was clear from her face. But she still nodded, as if that was enough. Later, his son asked where she had learned such understandable gestures if she lived alone. Lykov himself had thought about it. He said she had most likely observed hunters, people passing near her valley without even suspecting its existence. She saw people, even if they did not see her. Over long years of solitude, and her solitude, as he later understood, was truly long. She had studied them enough to communicate without words. He lived in that house for another 4 days, and this period was the most difficult for him to recount. His son noticed his father would begin to speak, stumble, stop mid-sentence, and try again, as if he himself could not fully comprehend what he had experienced. Not because he had forgotten. Simply the words he possessed made what had happened smaller and simpler than it really was. Already on the second day, the first full day of their time together, she began to explain to him what she considered important. She did this calmly, patiently, repeating the same thing with different gestures, as one explains meaning to someone who does not understand the language. First, she pointed to the house, circled the space around, then pointed to the taiga outside the window, then to herself and spread her hands. Empty, no one, alone. He understood. Then she changed her gestures. She showed before, movement, presence of several, then again emptiness. And he understood that too. Her people once existed, now they were gone, and only she remained. He tried to ask about time, pointed at her, then began counting on his fingers, raising his eyebrows. She watched his hand for a long time, then took it in hers, huge, warm, and began raising all 10 fingers again and again, over and over. He tried to count, but soon lost track. The number was too large to hold. She had lived there alone so long that counting lost meaning. On the third day, she moved to the main point, the reason she had allowed him to stay. At first, he did not understand. She explained again with gestures, pointed to herself, then to something small, emerging, then again to herself, to the emptiness around, and finally to him. He sat with this understanding for a long time. He thought about Matriona, about his son, about the essence of the request itself. There was no whim in it, no simple desire, only the desperation of the last one who knows that after them, there will be emptiness. He was a hunter and knew what it meant to be the last animal of a disappearing kind, the last one left of what had once been many. For him, it was not abstract, but utterly concrete. He thought honestly without trying to find a convenient answer. He thought of Matriona not as an excuse to refuse, but as a person to whom he owed honesty even in his thoughts. He thought about the solitude she had shown, not with words, but with gestures. And precisely because of that, it was heavier and more accurate than any words. It was a solitude so long that it ceased to be called solitude and became simply the environment in which she lived. And he understood that he would not be able to leave, leaving this behind. Not because she asked, but because he understood. And understanding obliges. On the fourth day, she gave him an object, a small one fitting in the palm of his hand. It was made of dark stone, smooth, covered with symbols whose meaning he could not decipher. The stone was warm, despite the cold in the house. He noticed that immediately. She placed it in his hand, closed his fingers with hers, and held them for several seconds. Then she let go. He perceived it not as payment, but as a connection, as something that would not allow what had happened to disappear without a trace. On the fifth day, he prepared to leave. She came out to see him off and walked beside him to the very edge of the valley, silently, neither approaching nor lagging behind. He felt the boundary, though outwardly nothing marked it. There she stopped. He went on. Once he turned back, she stood in place, motionless, huge, against the backdrop of dark spruce and gray November light. He never saw her again. But the stone she had given him he carried in his breast pocket until the end of his life. At home, he became noticeably quieter than before. Matriona noticed it immediately and continued to notice it afterward. Outwardly, everything remained as before. He answered, ate, worked, did his usual tasks. But inside him, something else had appeared. Calm, hidden, like a current beneath ice. Invisible, but perceptible if you know where to look. She tried more than once to bring the conversation to it carefully, indirectly, so as not to run into silence. Each time he gently avoided the subject, without irritation, but without openness. After 6 months, she decided to ask directly. One evening, when they were alone, she said, "Yegor, what happened there? I'm not asking to judge, just tell me." He was silent for a long time, then replied, "Nothing that can be explained." She quietly asked, "Try." He looked at her attentively, the way he rarely did, only when something truly important was at stake, and said, "If I tell you, you will live with it. Are you ready?" She thought and answered, "If you live with it, Then I can too. He fell silent again, then said, "Not now, someday." That someday never came. He never told her anything. She died without knowing the truth. That was his choice and his burden. That same object, the dark, warm stone with incomprehensible symbols, he kept with him in his breast pocket. Once Matriona saw him holding something in his hand by the window late in the evening, but noticing her, he immediately put it away. She did not ask. She understood she would not ask. It belonged to that same closed part of his life as that November trip. And she never returned to it again. For 20 years, she lived beside something she could not name. He continued to go into the Taiga along his usual routes, but never returned to that valley. Only once in 1980, his route passed nearby. He could have turned, but did not. He simply walked past without slowing down, looking straight ahead. Some places are left alone, those where too much has happened to return without reason, and too incomprehensible to know what to do upon returning. Life went on. Alexei grew up, started a family, grandchildren were born. Matriona grew old, turned gray, but remained the same, calm, patient, able to wait. Lykov aged beside her, worked less, sat more often by the window, or went a short distance into the forest, just to be in the silence he understood better than any language. Outwardly, everything was calm. Inside remained what he carried close to his heart and never revealed to anyone. The first changes came in the form of fatigue. Not ordinary fatigue after work, but deep, constant, one that does not disappear after rest. He woke tired, went to bed the same way, as if his strength was draining away irreversibly. This began in 1987, 9 years after that trip. Why then, and not earlier? He thought about it a lot and came to one explanation that seemed honest to him. Later, he told his son, 9 months would have been too fast, too obvious. But 9 years, that's just the period everyone will accept as normal aging. No one thinks about the taiga when a man starts failing at 59. They say, it's age. At first I thought so too, and then I stopped. Matriona insisted he see a doctor. He went to Yakutsk, underwent examinations. The doctor said, heart, blood pressure, age, nothing critical. Prescribed medication, a regimen, advised reducing workload. He followed everything, but it did not help. Then his joints began to fail, not gradually, but as if all at once. Knees, shoulders, fingers. It felt as though something inside had accelerated, breaking the normal course of time. The last time he went hunting was in 1989. Upon returning, he said to Alexei, "I won't go anymore. My legs aren't the same." His son was 33, his father 61, and for a hunter, this was not considered old age. In their parts, people went into the taiga even at 70. But Alexei already understood. Something was destroying his father faster than it should. Doctors offered various theories. Some spoke of autoimmune disorders, others of chronic inflammation of unknown origin. One specialist in Yakutsk simply looked at the tests and shook his head, not in alarm but in confusion, as if the picture did not fit any known diagnosis. Lykov listened to everyone calmly, with the expression of a man who felt, this is not it, but could not explain why. Matriona went with him to all examinations, sat beside him, held his hand. Before he would not have allowed that, now he did. By 1992, he had noticeably worsened. He almost stopped getting up, not because of pain, but because his body no longer obeyed him as before. Alexei came every week, sat beside him, talked about various things. One day he asked directly, "Father, what happened back then in '78? Lykov turned his head, looked at him for a long time and said, "Sit," and began to tell. He spoke for several hours, slowly, choosing words as carefully as he had chosen everything else throughout his life. Alexei did not interrupt. Matriona left at the beginning of the conversation. The father asked to be left alone with his son, and she did not return until the son himself came out to her. Lykov told everything, about the tracks, about the house, about her, about those 4 days, and about the object. Without embellishment, without trying to make the story more convincing, just as it had been. Later, Alexei said, he did not even think about whether to believe or not. He simply listened. His father did not know how to lie. Not because of principles, but because he simply could not. It was evident. In his entire life, Alexei had never once caught him even in a small lie. At the end, Lykov took from his breast pocket that same stone, the dark one with incomprehensible symbols, which he had carried for 14 years, and placed it between them on the blanket. Alexei took it in his hands. The stone was warm, not like an object warmed by the body, but differently, as if the warmth came from within. The symbols on its surface were deep, clear, unlike any known alphabet. He held it and thought that in his hands was something that had existed long before him, and perhaps even before his father, made by hands of which he knew only one thing: they were enormous. And then he asked, "Do you think it's connected? What's happening to you, and what happened then?" Lykov was silent for a moment, then quietly said, "Yes, I think she took something. Not intentionally, without ill will. She wasn't evil. I understood that then and understand it now. It's just how what lives in the taiga is ustroina, by its own laws, not human ones. Something passed from me to her, something without which a person over time seems to shrink from within. And it did not happen immediately. One time was not enough, but over the years, it accumulated." Alexei asked why his father had not told him earlier. Lykov looked at him with a gaze his son remembered for the rest of his life, without guilt, without regret, but with tired honesty. "I thought it would pass. I thought the body would cope. It didn't," he replied. Alexei asked one more question that troubled him: whether she had received what she wanted. Lykov lay for a long time with his eyes closed, then quietly said, "I don't know. I hope so. Because if not, then it was all for nothing, and I cannot believe that." That evening, they did not return to it. Alexei went out to his mother, sat with her in the kitchen. She asked what his father had spoken about. He answered briefly, about the taiga. She nodded and did not ask further. She knew how not to ask unnecessary questions. That was her particular skill, developed over years of living beside a man who spoke only when he considered it necessary. Lykov died in 1994, quietly, in his sleep, in the same room where 2 years earlier, he had told his son his story. He was 66. The documents listed heart failure. Formally, it was true, but not the whole truth. Matriona outlived him by 7 years. Alexei never told her everything. She was already old, and he was not sure the truth would bring her more good than pain. She died believing that her husband's health had simply failed him. Whether that was right, he did not know, and still does not. The stone remained with him. He showed it to various people. A geologist who worked in those parts immediately noticed the strange temperature. "Is it heated?" he asked. Alexei replied that it was not. It was always like that. The geologist studied the object for a long time, felt it, even smelled it, and then admitted, "I cannot determine the rock type. It doesn't resemble anything from local samples." And then, more quietly added, "A stone cannot be warm without a heat source. That violates basic principles." After that, he never returned to the subject. Another specialist who studied Siberian ornamental traditions carefully examined the symbols, through a magnifying glass, with photographs, comparing them with archives. In the end, he said that the symbols did not match any known system. Either this is an extremely rare, undocumented tradition, or something entirely outside the scientific field, he concluded. And he too noted the strange warmth of the stone. In 1998, Alexei tried to find that valley. He took his father's notes, reached the point where he had deviated from the route, and spent 2 days searching those places. He found the ravine, everything matched the description, but the valley was not there. He searched everywhere, checked every direction, nothing. Either he was looking in the wrong place, or everything had changed in 20 years, or the place does not reveal itself to everyone. The last explanation seems strange, but no more so than everything else in the story. So he did not reject it, and from time to time he continued to return to these thoughts. He often thought about whether she was still there, in that valley. He wondered whether she had received what she needed, the reason she had kept his father for 4 days. He also thought of something else, whether there was now someone in the Yakut Taiga who had appeared because of that story, someone walking through the snow leaving enormous tracks that any hunter would mistake for anything except their true nature. He had no answers. He did not search for them deliberately. He simply understood. If an answer exists, it is somewhere there, in that same taiga, in that valley he could not find in 98. Perhaps the valley itself did not want to be found. Perhaps it was not yet time. The Yakut Taiga does not change at all. There are places in it that exist on no map, not because they were poorly charted, but because some territories simply do not lend themselves to fixatia. They exist while you are in them, while you see them, and then they disappear, and even years later you cannot find them again. Hunters know this. They do not discuss it, do not explain it. They simply accept it as fact.
That same object lies in Alexei's desk drawer, next to his father's diaries. Sometimes he takes it out, holds it in his hands. The stone is warm, always warm. And over the decades, this has not changed. No one has deciphered the symbols on its surface. No one has explained the source of its warmth. These are simply two facts that exist without explanation. Over time, Alexei stopped looking for answers. He simply sometimes holds the stone, remembers his father, that valley, that November trip of '78. His father died at 66. For a hunter of his endurance, that is early, very early. It is an age when such men are still going into the forest and reading tracks no worse than in their youth. Something took years from him. He himself understood this and accepted it calmly without complaint, the way those accept who understand the cause and come to terms with it. He told his son one important thing: she wasn't evil. For him that mattered, that everything happened not out of malice, not out of intent to harm, but simply because that is how things are arranged. Because there are forces and laws that appeared long before people and act independently of us. Alexei lived a long life. He walked the same paths, knew those places just as well as his father, but he never searched for that valley again. He says simply, if it's needed, it will be found on its own. If not, then it's not needed. This too is part of that logic, not to rush what must happen by itself. The stone still lies in the drawer and remains warm. What it means, he does not know. He only knows that his father carried it for many years and showed it to no one. And before his death, he finally showed it and told everything. That means he wanted someone to know. That means it was not meant to disappear with him. And perhaps that knowledge alone is enough.